Hello, everyone. My name is Pete DiStefano, and we're going to get our 30-minute webinar going here. Again, my name is Pete DiStefano. I am in product marketing at SolarWinds for our SolarWinds application management solutions. I'm here today with my partner, Adam Hurt. He is the product manager for SolarWinds App Optics, one of our application and infrastructure monitoring tools. Adam is also the product manager for our shared services, and it's important because he continues to work together with the team to bring all of our SolarWinds application management tools closer and closer together. Let's get going. First of all, before I start the webinar, we're passing 4 polling questions to you right now. We just want to learn a little bit more about you, about the tools you're using, if any, and when you get ready to release some software, what are your top priorities? So if you wouldn't mind, as I'm going through a couple of things here, please fill out the poll questions. Another thing that's really important when you identify whether or not you've been successful with a webinar, it's the user's engagement. So I really do want to encourage you to ask questions. We are absolutely going to keep to our commitment to a 30-minute webinar, and we're going to do everything we can to answer all your questions. If we can't get to all of them, on Monday, we are also going to send out the presentation, and we're going to send out the recording. With that, we will answer any other questions. And having that recording is going to be important because after you experience this session, I'm sure you're going to want to share this with your family next week. Okay, not really. Why don't we get going here? Okay, before I start talking about what APM is, I'd like to talk a little bit about why things have had to change. So when we talk about the impact of software testing and how that's evolved, it really has a lot to do with software and how software has changed and the role of software has changed in companies. I used to say that software has become critical in many companies, in most companies. I'll tell you today that applications are critical in absolutely every company, every business. When I was a kid, I used to make a bunch of Kool-Aid, to beg my parents for some change, get some Dixie cups, go to the corner, and for $0.25 a piece, I'd sell a Dixie cup of Kool-Aid. Well, I live in Texas now, and in August it's really hot. And last summer I was driving through the neighborhood, and this girl had a lemonade stand. And of course, prices changed. The lemonade was $1 a piece. She actually had a square credit card reader attached to an Apple. So I could actually have used a credit card to buy my lemonade. Well, those aren't the companies I'm talking about here, but I'm telling you, the stakes have gotten higher, and I know you've all experienced that. With the reliance that companies have, and it's not just the external applications that are customer-facing, but also the internal applications. They have become so important to a business's success or failure. The stakes have become so much higher in what you do and the quality of that application before it goes out the door. And now we have this perfect storm. You've got this extremely high reliance on these applications, but they've changed. There was a time when you had a single monolithic application. And quite frankly, when there was a problem with that application, it wasn't terribly hard to figure out what was going on if there was a problem and then go and fix it. Well, today's modern applications, whether it's some combination of on-premise or cloud or some hybrid, the moving pieces have gone up exponentially. You've got microservices, and instead of just servers or hosts, you've got containers that are running pieces of these services. There's so many things to be looking at to really pinpoint exactly where the cause of a performance or breakdown in an application has become very complicated. And quite frankly, it's more difficult and it takes a lot more time. So testing and troubleshooting before you go live has always been important, but it's changed. There's a new basic criteria that you have. There's a whole new standard that's been set. It's no longer 9 point, whatever you want to call it. You're being held to a standard of perfection. Users are expecting flawless applications, and that puts a lot of pressure on people. So now, to take this one more step and throw a little more coal on the fire, All of you have seen these statistics. There's been research year over year on how expensive it is to fix a bug when it's in the field as opposed to fixing it before it goes. Well, that continues to be true, but that impact, again, has grown dramatically. And it's not just because of the resources and the complexity of the application to try to figure out what's going on when it's already deployed in the field, but the cost, not the resource of the engineers or support or operations or the time, but the impact it can have on your business is really making a difference. I've got some data here from the IBM Systems Science Institute. It's actually dated, talks about billions of dollars lost in shareholder value, $1 trillion being attributed lost because of software bugs. So, if this doesn't stress you out, and I'll tell you right now, I'm stressed out even talking about it. It really does change. Software bugs are not an IT problem anymore. Software bugs are a business problem. And if you're one of the folks that believes IT and the business need to be really tight, really close, I can't imagine it's any more true than it is today. So what is APM? And why are we going to talk about that? Well, first of all, simply put, it's a practice of managing the performance and availability of applications, including the infrastructure. But there's two sides to this coin, okay? And if you're an engineer or developer, you're probably familiar with the server side, what we call inside out, where you're digging into the application, the infrastructure, all the way down to the code level, looking at performance or errors in the application. But there's a whole client side, right? There's getting visibility into the application's availability and performance from the user's perspective. And you're probably saying, what the heck? How can I get that perspective if I even haven't gone out the door with the application yet? Well, you can, and we're going to talk about that and why we think that's a really important part of APM. So what we're going to do is, I'm going to talk here for a couple of moments about two different use cases we're going to show you for APM in a dev environment. One is the troubleshooting use case, and that's where you can use synthetic transaction tests to test all the critical workflows for an application. And by running those simulated synthetic tests, you can make sure that after you've done some coding, whether you're updating an application or it's brand new, test to make sure the application is completing successfully from an outside perspective. Matter of fact, you can run those tests from places all around the world. And if transaction fails, it'll tell you what step it's failed. Then from there, you go in and you look at that transaction in your application monitoring tool. You look at that trace request. You go into the details of that transaction to understand exactly, of all those moving parts I talked about, where is the latency issue? Where are the errors that are causing this application not to deliver as it's supposed to? And many of you probably also use logs or log monitoring, log management tools to troubleshoot when you have an application issue. And depending on how many logs you're bringing in, there's a suspect log line, you're looking at it, and now you want to look at all the other log lines associated with that, and you look at the ones before it or after it. But if you have a lot of log lines, it's really hard to figure out, and you're spending a lot of time searching to try and figure out what are all the log lines that are associated with that transaction so I can really dig down and figure out what's going on. Well, if your APM application tool working together with those logs can group all those logs together, so that transaction you were just looking at in the application monitoring tool, you drill down and you have all of the logs associated with that transaction. Now I could look at those side by side. I don't waste any time searching, and now I have visibility and I can quickly troubleshoot, get to the root cause, and solve that problem. Now let me take this to one more level. Let's just say you're in QA and you kind of know the applications, but you're not as intimate as the person who's been doing the coding. Having an APM tool that can also give you guidance on exactly what the most likely issue is with a specific transaction or a problem with a service, being able to quickly let the developer know that is another way to really accelerate the troubleshooting process and also providing accurate information so I can quickly get to that point. The other thing we're about to show you, and I'm going to stop talking here in a moment, is the use case for doing performance testing. Again, here you can use synthetic monitoring to test the performance of that application. whether you've defined a specific criteria for performance or it's an existing application you're updating and you have a baseline and you want to make sure that whatever you've done to change the application, you still deliver that performance, I can run synthetic tests to do that. Then I have the opportunity, now that I'm looking at my performance and whether it's good or not, and I make some changes, if it's not meeting the expectation, I then drill back into my application monitoring tool. I can look at the host resources. Is it a capacity issue with my infrastructure? Is it an issue with one of the services, right down to it could be a line of code, it could be a database query. So again, working hand in hand with both of these tools, I see where my issue is, I resolve it, and then I go back and I run my synthetic performance tests again, and I validate, that I've fixed the problem and my performance is where it should be. So this is both two examples. I've talked enough, I've showed you some slides. What we're going to do now is I'm going to pass the baton over to Adam, and he's going to actually demonstrate these two use cases using a combination of APM tools. It's all you, Adam.
So before we dive into the features and what the product looks like and how it can help you, I think it's important to talk about how do people troubleshoot in a development environment today? What have they done historically? If you're a developer type or worked with developers or even built a little Hello World app at one time, it's pretty common when you're working on something, kind of the tried and tested way is you add some print statements, right? If you're working on some code and you're testing it, you're usually, especially if it's a web application, maybe you're curling it from the command line to send some requests through. You're seeing if you're getting the response that you expected, and if you don't, you probably add some print statements along your code that says made it to here, or maybe you print out a variable here and there, and that historically has worked pretty well. Lots of people have done that. It's a very common practice. The downsides to using print statements in that kind of classic method is, what if you're working across containers and different services? What if you're working in a shared development environment and something you're only working on one particular service? If you can add maybe print statements to the piece that you're working on, but if it's not interacting properly with a downstream service, that kind of falls apart. Your print statements, it's probably possible to do it right, but it certainly becomes very difficult across distributed services and when you're working on shared infrastructure. And when you're just curling things from the command line, it's kind of hard to share the results of that with your team. So that's kind of how people do that today. So now we'll take a look at, hey, how could some of these APM tools, make it a little bit easier and to make it easier to share the information across your team members. So we're looking at AppOptics right now. We've got a bunch of different services in here kind of reporting their metrics. A lot of people would actually, we're going to take a look at one called the web tier. And a lot of people, when they're working in development, will have a service called web tier staging or web tier dev. Services are basically free, so you can just create them and destroy them as you see fit. So we're going to click on the web tier, and we're going to kind of skim over this part because there's a lot of information here that helps with monitoring in production. It's certainly important when you move from development or staging to production to see, once we went in the real world, was that performance what we expected? But we're actually going to move straight to what we call traces in this webinar. So when we go to traces, these are specific examples of requests that have hit this application that we have traced. So we kind of have like a visualization and lots of detail about the transaction. This is really, if you think about it, it's almost like automatic print statements across systems. So we're going to take a look at a specific example on this heat map. You can just drop box and select some. So we're selecting a trace that ended in a 302. It took 35 seconds. So if you imagine you're in a development environment and you're working on a new feature and you want to make sure it returns the right response codes and it is performant, if you see a status of 302 coming back in your development environment and it took 35 seconds, probably not the outcome that you wanted. right? It took way too long, and it ended in a 302 instead of probably a 200 that you were expecting. And if you were using the classic method of print statements, you know what, you could probably get close to figuring out why it was a 302, or at least understand that it was a 302. But it's very difficult to understand why something was slow using print statements. Probably going to be a lot of print statements, and it's going to be to do a lot of time of cycling through, which function was slow, et cetera, et cetera. And then if it's distributed systems, it just, adds to complexity. So we're going to take a look at the visualization for this request that took 35 seconds. We're just going to click on there. And this just comes from our instrumentation. So you just, as long as our library is included, this stuff is automatic. It's a lot less effort than putting in print statements. And we've got some information already. So we've got the time was 35 seconds. We spent 100% of our time in remote calls. We've got an error detected. We got a null pointer exception in our booking service error. And then we can see that, hey, 100% of the total request duration of that 35 seconds was spent on this service call. So from the service that we were troubleshooting, we're actually spending the entire time waiting on a downstream service. Again, the kind of classic command line troubleshooting probably takes a while to get there, and certainly to get the parameters and understand exactly what you're calling for from that downstream service. This is kind of like a high-level summary. It's great for sharing with team members to understand what's going on. But if you are the developer and you say, I need a bit more information than that, we have that as well. So this is, think about it, it's almost like a visualization of kind of these automatic print statements. We can kind of break down the components of what your application is actually doing in this request. We've got a 35-second timeout at the top. The request started in our WebTier service, in a Ruby on Rails application. Then we made this service call that took basically the entire duration. And we've got a couple of exceptions in here as well. We've got a bunch of servlet exceptions with back traces. We've got null pointer exceptions. So really a lot went wrong in this request that the developer is going to go have to solve really all of these things and get this transaction down to a good place where it's performant and it's not returning a 302 anymore. Easier to share with your teammates. If you're working on an issue, you can take a screenshot of this or add a link to a GitHub pull request so people can kind of understand what problems you're dealing with. And then to kind of take it one step further, if you are a developer that's used to working with logs, maybe you still have had some interesting logging that you want to see, we actually automatically tie the logs to this transaction together as well. So even if you're working across containers and distributed services, we have the option to essentially annotate all your logs with this transaction ID. So you can click on the search logs button. This works with SolarWinds Logly, which is what we're looking at here, as well as Papertrail and even third-party logging systems. And what this does is it shows you all the logs that contain that transaction ID. There's no guesswork across systems. Even this demo environment that we're looking at here happens to be running in Kubernetes, and this request transcended at least 2 different containers in this Kubernetes system. But it's simple and easy for us to troubleshoot. We can see all of the logs for the transaction, regardless of which container or service they were in. It's just all in one spot. The developers have to go looking in 5 different areas. It's just simple. They can see there was a 302. It took a long time. You understand there's 2 services involved, and then see the logs from all the services. So just an easy workflow for that developer. We were just really kind of focused on the developer working on the server side in that case. But like Pete was saying earlier, there really is a focus on the end user. And if we make this change, how is the end user performance affected? So one of the things we can do is we have page speed tests. And again, like Pete had mentioned, these can be automated. So you can, if you have like a staging environment or even a dev environment, you can just ping them at your application and say, hey, you know what, run this test every couple of minutes. I'm going to be working on this thing. and I want to see if I'm making the right changes. So things like, is our JavaScript minified? Do we make a change there? Are we, pulling images that are way too large? Is end user experience suffering from that? So you've got the end user experience in a page speed sense, and then you've got the timeline as well. And the other side of this kind of brings it all together is we also have synthetic transactions. So if you're working on an application and you're used to just doing curl every couple of minutes to see if it's working properly, synthetic transactions can be as simple as they just kind of act as curl and just open a web page, or they can actually be full transactions where if you're using a feature properly, where you script it, so a user goes to a website, opens a landing page, maybe logs in, clicks around, goes through a workflow, maybe goes through a purchase workflow, and then logs out again. And then when you're working on the changes, you want to make sure, this is really our end goal. We want to make sure this whole transaction works for the end user. That can be scripted in Pingdom and then just run continuously against your application. You can use this both in test and staging, in development, and then continue using that to monitor your production environment to make sure everything stays the same and it's doing what we expect it to. And this is just an example of a script here. It's pretty straightforward. It's going to go to our little demo site here. It's going to go click on an element, click on a couple of them, and then click on checkout. So a pretty basic one. And it's going to monitor both the success of all the steps and how long they take. And then that will also generate the traffic for you in AppOptics, so we can go back and kind of see the results of that on the server side in there. Again, with the logs, it's kind of full visibility from the end user, from loading the assets, to walking through transactions, see how long it takes on the server side. Kind of have this nice visualization of exactly what's going wrong, so your developers can certainly work faster, have a better understanding of where the problem may be, and certainly be able to share that information with team members. And we've got about 7 minutes left, which is probably a good time for Q&A.
Yeah, actually, we do have several questions. And by the way, for those, if you haven't asked a question yet, feel free to jump in, throw them in there, and we'll go through these. Adam, one of the first questions I have is, can you test the performance of the application launched through Citrix?
Good question. So it kind of depends on what the back end of the application is. I'm not super familiar with Citrix, but I believe you can still host kind of whatever languages you want in the back end. So we have APM libraries, so kind of for that tracing visualization that I showed, for 8 different languages, so for things like Java, .NET, PHP, Node, Golang, Scala. There's a whole variety of them. So as long as your application is written in kind of one of those common languages, then you can absolutely use that tool.
Okay, cool. We've got a few more here. By the way, we do have a couple of poll questions we're firing in your direction, so look out for those. Another question I have here on how does the integration work between, say, I think it was AppOptics, and you mentioned your Logly log manager?
Yeah. So the way that works is once you're using our APM library, there's just like a config option there of, hey, do you want to add this transaction ID to all of the log lines that are going out from your application? So you don't have to go in one by one and say, hey, add a trace ID to this log line. You can do it to everything. And one of the nice things is about that is you have the option to do it to just the request that were traced. AppOptics does work on a stamp rate. But then you can also just have it, that transaction ID applied to all of your log lines all the time. So really, you don't always have to go from AppOptics to logs. You can just go straight to your logging product. And if you see a bad problem in there, look at the transaction ID associated with it and then filter down on that and say, hey, you know what, just show me all of the logs associated with this request, and it just removes the guesswork from using logs.
All right. There was a follow-up question to that. How hard is it to get this integration working so you can see these log lines?
Yeah, that's
together. Sorry.
Yeah, super easy. So once you're running our APM library, it's just going to be option. You can just flip it on. So not difficult at all.
We just got another one that's kind of related to your last question. You mentioned sampling. What if I need to look at a specific transaction and it wasn't part of the sampling?
Yeah, so I should have mentioned this one too. So especially if you're a developer working on something, and you know this can even happen in a live environment. If you want to see the trace from a very specific request, so let's say a user reported an issue where I don't know they were searching for a specific photo or some very specific query parameters, you can actually when you make a request from the command line or even using something like Postman, you can add a little header to it that says, hey, trace this request and give me the ID back. And then when it returns the ID, you can just go into the UI and say, hey, show me this specific trace. And then there's no kind of fiddling around in the UI. You can just visualize the exact trace that you're looking for.
Okay. You kind of touched on this, but we did get one more. What languages are supported by AppOptics?
Yeah, so we're pretty much everything common. So Java, .NET, Node, PHP, Scala, Ruby, Golang. I think that's it. I'm probably missing one.
Okay. Well, I think, unless there's any other questions, there's just a couple more things I want to share, and we'll call it a wrap. Looks like we have about 120 seconds left in our 30-minute session. Just kind of key takeaways. We made a strong point about how important applications are and how really that has really the combination of the complexity of applications and the importance has really put a lot of pressure, a lot of stress on delivering high quality applications. APM should play a major role. APM tools are used obviously not just in a dev environment, but in production environment, but really are becoming a required tool in a development environment. The only other thing I wanted to share with you today, we talked a little bit about all three of these products. When you get your slide deck, there's links here. If you do want to learn more about the SolarWinds Application Management Suite, SolarWinds Pingdom, that's where we did the client side monitoring and the synthetics. Pingdom also has a real user monitor, which is really more applicable to after you're in production. Of course, SolarWinds AppOptics, as we talked a lot about, the deep diving into the application. And then finally, SolarWinds Loggly is a tool that's integrated with AppOptics for doing your log analysis and consolidation. So thank you, Adam, for sharing and doing a great demonstration. Thank you all for spending time with us today. I hope you found this valuable. And as I mentioned, on Monday, we'll give you a recording. We'll give you a copy of this presentation. And we covered all the questions, so we won't have to do that. Other than that, I think we're done, and I appreciate everyone's time. Have a great day.